The fluorescent lights hummed like insects trapped in plastic coffins. Katie Morrison pushed through the trauma bay doors at 2,245 hours, her badge clipped to the pocket of fresh scrubs, her jaw already tight from the shift ahead. Sacred Heart Hospital in San Diego meant trauma, meant decisions made in seconds, meant the weight of lives balanced on steady hands. She'd been doing this for 2 years, 2 years of keeping her head down, her voice soft, her past buried beneath layers of professionalism that felt like armor made of cotton and lies. The emergency department smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Her nostrils burned with it as she moved through the hallway, nodding to the charge nurse, avoiding the cluster of residents near the trauma board. Nobody asked questions about her. That was the deal she'd made with herself. Keep the limp subtle. Keep the tremor in her right hand hidden until she was alone in the supply closet. Keep the worn combat boots locked in her locker beneath spare scrubs where nobody sane would look, where nobody would ask about the sand still embedded in the laces, where nobody would notice the regulation knots tied tight enough to hold under water, under fire, under the weight of bodies. The night shift was hers. 12 hours of controlled chaos, of organized necessity, of helping without being noticed. She moved through the corridors like water finding the lowest path, efficient and unobtrusive. Her left leg, the rebuilt one, the one that had taken shrapnel in Tikrit 3 years ago, ached in a way she'd learned to manage. Physical therapy had given her back mobility but not invisibility. The limp was there if you looked, if you knew how to read the slight hesitation when she pivoted on that side. She made sure she pivoted when nobody was watching. The supply closet door swung open with the familiar creak. Katie stepped inside, letting the cool darkness settle around her like a uniform. Shelves lined the walls, gauze in different gauzes, syringes sorted by gauge number, for bags hanging like clear fruit, trauma shears with the hospital logo embossed on black handles. She pulled out her small notebook and began counting. Morphine ampules. Fentanyl syringes. Ketamine vials. The numbers had to balance. They never balanced. This was the 3rd week the count was off. 12 ampules of morphine missing. 8 syringes of fentanyl. The kind of shortage that happened when someone wasn't ordering correctly or when someone was diverting. Katie's jaw tightened. She'd seen addiction destroy entire units. She knew the signs, the timing of pain complaints, the patterns in which patients got which medications, the subtle tells of a person slowly stealing their way toward oblivion. She wasn't sure yet if the discrepancy was negligence or criminal, but she knew it was wrong. She photographed the shelf with her phone, capturing the handwritten tally in the ledger, the dates, the signatures. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who documented battlefield losses, who understood that small numbers meant specific failures, that each missing dose was a chart entry pointing to a question that needed answering. 5 years of active duty had taught her that details mattered. That precision saved lives. Working late again, Morrison. Katie's shoulders didn't tense. She turned slowly, phone already pocketed, face composed into the careful blankness she'd perfected over 24 months in this hospital. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light like money. His suit cost more than Katie made in a month, charcoal gray, tailored at the shoulders, the kind of garment that announced confidence and connection and the absolute certainty that you belonged exactly where you were. Around his wrist, a Rolex caught the light. Around his neck, a silk tie that probably had a price tag she'd never seen before. Inventory check, she said quietly. Her voice was soft, practiced soft, the voice she'd built for this new life. Nothing in it suggested the command she used to give, the way she'd once ordered 17 people to move toward danger while she covered their exit. Numbers aren't matching the charts. Sterling stepped into the closet. He was tall enough that his presence seemed to compress the air. His eyes moved across the shelves with the casual disinterest of someone who'd never actually needed to inventory anything in his life. Hospital accounting handles that. Not nursing. Someone's pulling medications that aren't charted. She said it flatly, without accusation, just as an observation. That was her mistake. A small one, but the kind of mistake that made powerful men notice you. Sterling's eyes shifted back to her face, and she felt the moment his interest crystallized from casual dismissal to something sharper. "You've been working nights long." His tone hadn't changed, but the question had teeth. 2 years, sir. And you're just now noticing discrepancies. Katie met his eyes. She shouldn't have. She should have dropped her gaze like the quiet nurse she was pretending to be. But something in his face, the assumption that she wouldn't push back, that she was just a floor nurse who didn't understand how hospitals actually worked, made her answer without the practiced deference. "They started 3 weeks ago." Sterling smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then I'm sure accounting will find a perfectly reasonable explanation." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "You ever think about moving to day shift, Morrison? Nights can be hard on people who aren't cut out for the stress." She didn't respond. She simply returned to counting medications, her hands perfectly steady, her jaw locked tight enough to crack teeth. She heard him leave, heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway, and only then did she let out the careful breath she'd been holding. The inventory discrepancy meant trouble. She understood trouble. She'd lived in trouble for 12 years, 3 tours in Helmand and Nangarhar and Tikrit, 5 years in the operational envelope where trouble was the baseline and peace was something that happened to other people. But this trouble was different. This trouble could get people hurt in ways that didn't involve IEDs or ambushes. This trouble had a Rolex and a silk tie and the kind of institutional power that made questions disappear. She finished the count, photographed it again from a different angle, and texted the pictures to her personal email. Insurance. Evidence. The kind of documentation that saved lives by making the truth impossible to hide. Then she pushed the supply closet door open and moved back into the controlled chaos of the emergency department. The waiting room was fuller than usual for a Tuesday night. She helped triage a kid with a skateboard fracture, a woman with chest pains who turned out to be anxiety, an elderly man who'd fallen and wanted to make sure nothing was broken. The rhythm of it was familiar. Assessment. Documentation. Knowing what mattered and what was performance. Knowing which patients needed emergency attention and which needed someone to sit with them in the dark and tell them everything would be okay. Katie understood the difference. She'd spent her career making those decisions. Just not in scrubs. Not in a hospital. She'd made them in the desert, where the light was so bright it hurt and the danger was invisible until the moment it wasn't, and the only thing between life and death was the quality of your decision-making under pressure. Around 0130 hours, the ambulance alert came through. Active trauma. Shrapnel wound to the chest cavity. Incoming ETA for minutes. The emergency department transformed instantly from background hum into focused intensity. The trauma bay doors opened. Equipment moved. For stands positioned. The nursing staff shifted into organized precision, everyone knowing their role, everyone moving without needing instructions. Katie moved with them. She was at the bay entrance when the ambulance doors swung open and the paramedics emerged with the stretcher, already calling vitals into the noise. Male patient. Sergeant Major with the Marine insignia still on his jacket, the fabric torn around a wound that had bled through 3 bandages. Shrapnel lodged somewhere near the right side of his chest, visible in the X-ray images the paramedic was already handing off. BP dropping. O2 sat at 92 and falling. Bay 3, the trauma charge nurse called out. Get him on the monitor. 2 large bore 4s. Type N cross. Trauma surgery to the OR in 2. Katie moved to the stretcher as they wheeled it into the bay. The sergeant major was conscious, his breathing rapid and shallow, his eyes focused on the ceiling with the kind of attention that people got when they knew their body was failing. She'd seen that look before. She'd had that look before. She'd been on a stretcher with shrapnel lodged in her leg, watching the helicopter rotor blades blur above her, knowing that the next 90 seconds would determine whether she got the next 90 years. She leaned over him. Sergeant Major, I'm Katie. I need to assess your wound. I'm going to check the entry point and the severity. Stay with me. His eyes shifted to her. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in them. Recognition. Not of her specifically, but of something in her voice, something in the way she moved around the wound that wasn't tentative, wasn't cautious. She was handling the exposed shrapnel with the certainty of someone who'd done this before, someone who understood the anatomy of penetrating trauma, someone who knew which movements would dislodge the metal and which would keep it stable. She ran her fingers around the wound site, palpating, assessing depth and trajectory. The shrapnel was maybe 3 centimeters from the pericardium. One slip. One wrong movement during transport and it would puncture the heart lining. Cardiac tamponade. She'd seen it. She prevented it. She'd lost people to it. Her hands moved with automatic precision, her breathing controlled, her focus narrowed to the geography of his chest and the metal that was trying to kill him. Central line, she said to the resident. 14-gauge angiocath. I'm going subclavian. Get me the ultrasound. A corpsman, Navy, she could tell from his stance, from the way he moved with military efficiency, stepped closer to hand her supplies. He was watching her hands. She felt the weight of his attention, felt the moment his eyes went narrow. He was young, maybe 24, with the build of someone who'd carried ammunition and weapons across difficult terrain. He was watching the way her fingers positioned the needle, the angle of her wrist, the absolute steadiness of hands that shouldn't be that steady on a night shift in a civilian hospital. The needle went in. The subclavian vein found. The line secured. She moved with economy of motion, nothing wasted, nothing hesitated. Everything muscle memory drawn from a lifetime that she'd spent the last 2 years trying to forget. That's a Tikrit cross-clamp technique, the corpsman whispered. His voice was barely audible, just barely above the noise of the monitor and the beeping of the 4 pump. Where the hell did you learn that? Katie's hands continued working. She didn't pause. She didn't look at him. She tied off the line with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, who'd trained under Navy combat surgeons in field hospitals where there was no margin for error because the error meant death. Nursing school, she said quietly. Professional distance. The voice of someone who just happened to know advanced trauma techniques. Trauma certification. You pick things up. Nobody picks up Tikrit techniques from textbooks, Chief. There it was. The word that used to be her identity. Chief. Not nurse. Not Morrison. Chief. The rank she'd earned over 12 years of service, 5 tours through fire, decorations she kept in a box that she never opened because opening it meant remembering who she'd been before the classified operation went sideways, before Tikrit stopped being a place on a map and became the place where everything changed, before records got buried and people who asked questions got quietly removed from the operational envelope. She still didn't look at him. The sergeant major was stable. The monitors were steady. The shrapnel was contained. The line was secure. She stepped back from the stretcher with the control of someone who'd practiced this exact movement 1,000 times, who'd learned that you could be falling apart on the inside and look absolutely composed on the outside. Get him to radiology, she said to the trauma team. Chest CT with contrast. And someone notified Dr. Sterling. This one's going to need surgical intervention. The stretcher rolled out of the bay. The corpsman stayed, watching her with the intensity of someone who'd just watched a ghost walk out of the desert wearing a hospital badge. His jaw was tight. His eyes were narrowed. He was connected to something, some unit, some network, some memory of Tikrit that Katie had spent 24 months trying to bury beneath the routine of night shifts and inventory counts and the careful performance of being someone that nobody would ever look at twice. Katie moved to the sink and washed her hands. The warm water cascaded over skin that had held weapons and bandages and the weight of other people's survival. She watched the water disappear down the drain. The corpsman didn't move. He was waiting for her to say something, to confirm something, to acknowledge that he'd recognized what his hands had just witnessed. She dried her hands on a paper towel and met his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. I need to chart these vitals, she said. Her voice was soft again, carefully soft, the voice of a civilian nurse with nothing to hide. Good work on the transport. She walked past him before he could respond, before he could ask the questions that were already forming behind his eyes. Behind her, she felt his gaze track her all the way to the nurse's station. The night shift continued around her, beeping monitors, ringing phones, the organized chaos of people trying to keep other people alive. But something had shifted. The corpsman knew something. The sergeant major, with his eyes that had flickered with recognition, with his uniform that still carried the weight of something classified, knew something. And Dr. Sterling, with his Rolex and his silk tie and his absolute certainty that he could control anyone who asked inconvenient questions, didn't know that the quiet nurse with the limp and the tremor in her right hand was something else entirely. What happened next would change everything. But Katie Morrison didn't know that yet. All she knew was that her careful compartmentalization, the separation she'd built between her two lives, had just developed its first crack. And cracks, she understood from long experience, had a way of becoming chasms if you weren't careful. She pulled up the sergeant major's chart and began to write. The morning staff meeting at Sacred Heart started like all the others, fluorescent overhead panels casting everything in clinical white, 27 chairs arranged in neat rows, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the Bush administration. Katie sat in the third row, her notebook open, hands folded. She'd learned years ago that visible hands meant visible compliance. Dr. Sterling stood at the front with a laser pointer, walking through a case presentation about a 42-year-old with septic shock, when he paused mid-sentence and turned toward her. The room's energy shifted like prey sensing a predator's attention. "Ah, Nurse Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the kind of false warmth that made everyone's skin tighten. "You were on duty when Mr. Harrison came in yesterday. Tell us about your assessment." Katie stood. Vitals on arrival, 98.2 core temperature, BP 102/58, heart rate 118. I documented lactate elevation consistent with sepsis progression. "And where exactly did you learn that correlation?" Sterling's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your nursing degree, I assume? Or was it more of an observation-based education? You know, watching us actually practice medicine." 3 residents laughed, the ones who needed his letters for fellowship programs. The laugh was thin, conditional, the kind that stopped the moment he stopped smiling. Katie didn't blink. "RN board certification, doctor. That's public record." "Of course it is." He turned back to his presentation, but the damage was done. The seed was planted. By lunch, 2 nurses had asked her where she actually went to school. By evening shift, someone had left a comment on the internal forum questioning her credentials. Sterling was already doing what he did best, creating momentum through innuendo, building a narrative that would feel inevitable when it culminated. But the real strike came at 1,400 hours in the cafeteria. Katie carried her tray, turkey sandwich, apple, water, toward the corner tables where the nursing staff sat today. The doctor's section occupied the prime real estate by the windows, and Sterling sat at the center like a general surveying conquered territory. He didn't see her coming until she was 10 feet away. Then he stood. "Deliberate. Slow. Everyone," he said, his voice pitched to carry across the entire room. "I'm taking bets on how long our new night shift nurse lasts. She's been here, what, 2 weeks? 3? Anyone want to guess when she'll realize she's in over her head?" The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that came from respect. The kind that came from people recognizing a public execution when they saw one. Katie could have turned around. She could have walked out. Instead, she kept moving forward because running was what prey did, and she'd stopped being prey a long time ago. Sterling stepped into her path. His hand came up almost casually, and then her tray was airborne. The bowl of soup arced like a slow-motion parabola, and Katie watched it happen as if watching someone else's disaster unfold. Liquid spread across the tile floor in a dark bloom. The bowl clattered and rolled. Silverware scattered like shrapnel across linoleum, each piece marking impact in its own small explosion of sound. "Oops," Sterling said. He reached down and grabbed a patient chart from the table beside him, not his own, someone else's, and threw it at her feet. Pages exploded outward, scattering across the spilled soup like white leaves landing in dark water. "Pick that up, sweetheart. You're good at cleaning up messes, right? That's what nurses do." 20 staff members froze. Not because they agreed with him. Because they understood the power differential, the danger of movement, the mathematics of career survival. In a room full of witnesses, witnessing meant nothing. Testimony would mean everything, and testimony required choosing a side. Nobody chose publicly. Katie stood in the spreading puddle. She took one measured breath, the kind that came from somewhere deep, the kind that military trainers taught you to take when adrenaline wanted to flood your system and make you do something that would end with a jail sentence. Her shoulders rose. Held. Fell. A single tear escaped down her right cheek. Just one. She watched it happen with the part of her mind that still observed, still documented, still filed away evidence for later analysis. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Never breaking eye contact. Then she knelt. Gathered the pages with hands that didn't shake, that moved with the fluid precision of someone who had performed far more complicated tasks under far worse conditions. Her movements were economical. Medical-grade efficient. She stood with the chart pressed to her chest and said, in a voice like steel wrapped in silk, like a .50 caliber round moving through empty space with absolute purpose and no hesitation, "I've picked up pieces of better men than you from desert sand, Doctor." The room didn't go quiet. It had already been quiet. This was something else. This was the kind of silence that happens when a door opens onto something everyone recognizes but nobody wants to acknowledge. When the person standing in front of you suddenly occupies more space than their body should allow, when the air around them seems to have changed density and pressure. Sterling's face flushed red, actual red, the kind that came from blood rushing into tissues, from the autonomic nervous system firing anger responses he'd spent his whole life using to dominate people who didn't know how to push back. He forced a laugh. Mechanical. Fragile. "See," he said to his residents, his voice carrying a desperate edge he probably didn't realize was audible. "Dramatic. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. She won't last a week. Who wants to take that bet?" Katie turned and walked out of the cafeteria. She didn't rush. She didn't hurry. She walked like someone who knew exactly where they were going and why, and her departure left a trail of psychological wreckage that would take Sterling weeks to rebuild. In the parking lot at 1,630 hours, she sat in her 15-year-old Honda Civic, gray, unremarkable, the kind of car that didn't draw attention. She opened her phone. Found the photo she'd kept hidden in a private folder protected by a passcode that was her mother's birthday. 7 faces in desert camis, grinning at the camera, weapons slung low, the kind of exhausted joy that only came after surviving something that was supposed to kill you. Most of them dead now. Pieces of them distributed across the Tikrit sector in ways that the official incident reports would never detail. She whispered to the photograph, to the ghosts in digital form, "I'm trying to stay invisible like they told me." But invisible was becoming difficult. Because the sergeant major in the trauma bay had recognized something in her hands. And soon, very soon, the sergeant major would crash in a way that Sterling's protocols couldn't handle. And Katie would have to choose between the life she'd been given and the identity she'd buried. The fluorescent lights of the hospital glowed against the darkening sky behind her. 2 hours until her shift started. 2 hours until the sirens would wail and the doors would burst open and muscle memory would take over, burning away her carefully constructed cover like thermite through steel. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2,143 hours, before Katie could finish restocking the trauma bay, ambulance sirens wailed into the emergency drive. The kind of wailing that meant incoming, that meant critical, that meant the night shift was about to become something else entirely. The automatic doors hissed open and a Navy corpsman burst through with a Marine sergeant major draped across his shoulders, blood seeping through field dressings that had been applied somewhere dark and distant, probably in a parking lot 2 miles from here. The Marine was conscious but fading, his lips gone grey, his uniform torn open to expose chest wounds that caught the light like terrible geometry. Katie moved before Sterling even appeared. Her hands found the wounds without hesitation, fingers assessing with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from having done it under mortar fire, under pressure, under the absolute knowledge that the next 3 minutes would determine whether someone went home in a coffin or went home at all. She was palpating the chest for tamponade signs, checking for the subtle resistance that meant blood was collecting in the pericardium, using a 3-point compression technique that she'd learned from a corpsman named Mitchell who died in Anbar province 6 years ago. The Navy corpsman froze mid-handoff. His eyes locked on her hands. Then her face. Then back to her hands. "That's a Tikrit cross-clamp technique," he whispered. "Where the hell did you learn that?" Katie's hand stopped for half a heartbeat. Her eyes met his with the kind of look that could cut glass, the kind that said, "Not now. Not here. Later, maybe, if you're smart enough to know we're having a conversation that only exists in glances and subtext." She continued her assessment without answering. Already checking pupil response against peripheral pulse strength, already knowing what Sterling wouldn't understand for another 6 minutes. Dr. Sterling arrived, and the moment shattered like dropped glass. The sergeant major arrived at 2,143 hours with shrapnel mapped against his sternum like a constellation of death. Katie stood across the trauma bay from Dr. Sterling, her hands moving through the preliminary assessment with the kind of precision that comes from working under fire, literally. Ultrasound probe. Steady pressure. Reading the echoes like a language she'd learned in Tikrit, where IEDs didn't care about protocol and dying soldiers cared even less. Pneumothorax on the right, she stated, her voice level as a laser. Entry wound 4 centimeters superior to the nipple line. Trajectory suggests fragmentation near the hilum. Sterling's eyes narrowed. She'd spoken out of turn. Spoken like she knew something. "Thank you, Nurse Morrison," he said, the words coated in ice. "We have residents for assessment." The resident scrambled, checking vitals, starting lines, their movements efficient but mechanical. Katie stepped back from the bedside without protest. She'd learned the architecture of hospitals over 18 months, learned that speaking too much cost you access. The sergeant major's blood pressure was already dropping. 98/60. The shrapnel was closer to his heart than the imaging had suggested. She knew this the way soldiers know when an ambush is coming, not from evidence, but from bone-deep recognition of danger. Sterling barked orders like a conductor orchestrating incompetence. "Call cardiothoracic. Tell them we have a penetrating chest trauma with foreign bodies in close proximity to the mediastinum. ETA to OR is 60 minutes. 60 minutes. Katie's jaw tightened just enough that nobody watching could have named it as reaction. She'd seen exsanguination happen in less time than that. She'd held pressure on a femoral artery while a medevac was 40 minutes away, watching the patient's eyes go from focus to absent, feeling the pulse weaken under her palms like a radio signal fading. The surgical team began assembling in anticipation, and Katie found herself reassigned without announcement. Dr. Sterling simply appeared at her shoulder as the sergeant major was moved to a pre-op holding bay, his condition stable for the moment, the window everyone wanted to believe in, the magical pause before the body decided it was done. "You'll take desk duties in medical records," Sterling said. "Effective immediately. We need someone filing incident reports and organizing surgical schedules. You're perfect for it." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a cage with polite language. The trauma rotation, Katie began, "is for nurses with appropriate experience and credentials," Sterling said, his voice smooth as river stones. "I need someone with your attention to detail, handling documentation. It's actually more critical work." He was good at this. Competent. He wasn't screaming or threatening, he was simply removing her from the field in a way that looked like administrative logistics. By the time anyone realized what had happened, she'd be 3 floors up in a records room, filing paperwork while the sergeant major went to OR without the one person in this hospital who understood what the shrapnel would do. Katie nodded. Accepted. Disappeared upstairs with a cardboard box of intake forms and the sound of her own heartbeat like a metronome in her skull. The surgical team continued prepping. An attending surgeon arrived, not the cardiothoracic specialist Sterling had called, but Dr. Chen from general surgery, competent and solid and not trained for cardiac-adjacent trauma. Katie could hear the conversations filtering up through the ventilation system if she positioned herself right, standing in the records room with a stack of files she wasn't reading, waiting. The sergeant major's vitals remained stable. The window held. Nobody moved with urgency because there was no urgency yet, and that was how you died, waiting for the crisis to become obvious instead of recognizing it as inevitable. At 01 for 7 hours, she heard the intercom crackle. Page for Dr. Sterling. She heard his footsteps in the hallway below, brisk and authoritative. She heard him tell the resident, "Keep him stable. We have time. Surgery at 0300 is acceptable." He was wrong. But he was the physician, and she was the nurse filing intake reports in a room that smelled like aging paper and fluorescent anxiety. The crash came at 0200 hours exactly. The intercom shrieked. Code blue, trauma recovery. Katie was already moving, forms forgotten, muscle memory converting to motion before conscious thought could follow. Down the stairwell. 2 floors. Her shoe silent on the tile because she'd learned to move without sound, and that skill had never left her. The scene inside the bay was controlled chaos, controlled because everyone here had trained for exactly this, chaos because a human heart was failing beneath fluorescent lights. The sergeant major's chest rose and fell with mechanical assistance. The monitor showed a tight, constricted rhythm like a fist clenching. Cardiac tamponade, one of the residents said. Pressure 60/30 and dropping. Katie could see it written in the patient's color, that gray-blue pallor that meant the pericardial sac was filling with blood, compressing the heart, squeezing it like a hand closing around something fragile. Dr. Chen looked toward Sterling, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Get him to OR now," Sterling commanded. "Cardiothoracic is 40 minutes out," Katie said. She was already moving toward the ultrasound machine, muscle memory taking over the way it did when there was no time for permission. "We don't have 40 minutes. Sterling's head turned. "You? Why are you?" "Cardiac output is failing," Katie said. Not a request. A statement of fact. She positioned the ultrasound probe, angled it, found the dark fluid surrounding the heart like an accusation. 120 cc minimum. Maybe more. The rhythm on the monitor slowed. 70. 60. The sergeant major's blood pressure was a whisper now, 58/26. Katie grabbed an 18-gauge needle from the crash cart, her hand steady as surgical steel. The xiphoid process. 45-degree angle. She knew this geometry the way she knew her own heartbeat. She'd done this under fire with a flashlight held in someone's teeth and incoming round snapping branches overhead. She could do it in her sleep. She could do it blind. "You're not authorized," Sterling started. The needle slid home. Below the xiphoid, into the pericardial space, and immediately the hiss of air escaping as pressure released. Dark blood drawn back into the syringe. 15 cc or 30. 60. The monitor beeped once. Twice. The rhythm strengthened. 120 cc, Katie said quietly, documenting the time and volume in the chart with handwriting that belonged to someone who'd written casualty reports in Arabic and English and the universal language of organized grief. Patient responding to pericardiocentesis. Vital signs stabilizing. The sergeant major's blood pressure climbed. 72/41. The rhythm settled into something almost normal. Sterling stared at her with an expression that cycled through shock, rage, and calculation. He chose rage. You just performed a cardiac intervention without authorization. You just committed a felony violation of scope of practice. You are suspended, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. He was dying, Katie said. It wasn't a defense. It was a statement of what had been true 30 seconds ago. And now he's stable enough for surgery, Ellis the corpsman said from the corner where nobody had noticed him standing. I witnessed the whole thing. Appropriate technique. Appropriate indication. She just saved his life. Sterling's jaw worked silently. His hands opened and closed. For a moment, something dangerous flickered behind his eyes, not the institutional anger of a physician protecting his authority, but something older and darker. The look of a man realizing that the hierarchy he'd built was made of paper. "Get out of this room," he said to Katie, each word precisely enunciated. "You're suspended pending investigation by the nursing board. Don't approach any patient. Don't enter this ward. Security is waiting." Katie looked at the sergeant major once more. His eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell with steady, reassuring rhythm. The heart monitor beeped in its measured cadence, proof that he was still here, still alive, still part of a world that usually forgot about people like him until they became convenient statistics. "He needs manual monitoring for the next 10 hours, Katie said. "Blood pressures every 15 minutes. Checking for reaccumulation. Someone needs to stay with him." "I'll assign a resident," Sterling said. The resident Sterling assigned was from his own service, a tired-looking third year who arrived at the bedside at 0215 and was asleep in the chair by 0345, his chin resting against his chest, one hand still loosely holding the blood pressure cuff. Katie watched from the hallway window, watching the sergeant major's chest rise and fall, watching the monitor trace its steady rhythm, watching a man continue to exist through the simple fact of her having refused to let him stop. At 0400, the sleeping resident stood up, stretched, mumbled something about needing coffee. He didn't return. Katie waited exactly 90 seconds. Then she slipped into the room like someone returning to a place they'd never actually left. Katie waited 90 seconds. Then she slipped back into the room like someone returning to a place she'd never actually left. The sergeant major lay motionless under soft blue monitor light, his chest rising and falling in syncopated rhythm with the ventilator. 16 breaths per minute. His color was ashen, lips tinged violet. She could hear his heart through the speaker, not steady, not strong, just barely insisting that blood move through his vessels. The central venous pressure line ran from his subclavian vein down into the right atrium, a gossamer thread of data that told her everything the monitors wouldn't. The numbers were deteriorating. CVP climbing. Pulse climbing with it. His body was drowning in its own fluid. Katie pulled the stool to his bedside and Saturday. For in the morning. The hospital had that particular quality of silence that only comes when the night shift is too thin on ground and exhaustion makes people move like ghosts through the corridors. She could hear the rain starting outside, percussion against the windows that sounded like applause for nothing. She reached for his wrist. Checked his radial pulse manually, not trusting the machines. 142 beats per minute. Too fast. Thready. A pulse like a bird trapped in a cage, desperate and diminishing. His hand was cold. She adjusted the bear hugger warming blanket by 0.5 degree and waited. At 0215, his pressure spiked again. Not a spike. A crash. His blood pressure dropped to 68/40, and the ventilator alarm screamed for help that wasn't coming because Sterling had made sure she was invisible. Katie moved before her conscious mind caught up. She opened the emergency tray with the precision of someone who had done this in sand and darkness while artillery rounds walked across corrugated steel. The needle went in steady. 14-gauge angiocath. Her hands moved on their own, through the skin, through the muscle, into the pericardial sac. The hiss of air escaping. Instant relief. The pressure valve released. His vital signs stabilized like a prayer answered. BP climbed to 94/58. His heart rate dropped to 98. The monitor steadied. The bedside spiraled back into quiet. Katie held the needle for 30 seconds longer, confirming the tamponade was fully relieved, then withdrew. She disposed of the equipment in the sharps container and returned to the stool. The numbers on the central venous pressure monitor were holding. Barely. But holding. She checked her watch. 4 hours and 16 minutes until shift change. until Sterling would return with his investigators and his forged complaints and his certainty that he had won. She had 4 hours and 16 minutes to keep a sergeant major alive. Katie placed her left hand on his wrist and her right on his shoulder, not clinical, not medical. Just present. She began to whisper. The words came from a part of her that lived in another time, another country, another version of herself who had run at dawn in formation with 6 other women who believed they were immortal. 1 mile, no sweat, she whispered. 2 miles, better yet. 3 miles, see you soon. 4 miles in the sun, who's got it, we got it, Marines won't quit it. The cadence her unit had run 1,000 times. The sergeant major's eyelids twitched. His fingers moved against hers, not a conscious gesture, but a nervous system recognizing something in the rhythm that belonged to him. She monitored the CVP pressures with the attentiveness of a sniper reading wind. Every decimal point mattered. At 0343, the pressure climbed again toward the danger zone, 12.8, 12.9, 13.1, and Katie was moving before it peaked, her hand steady as surgical steel. The second needle aspiration took 38 seconds. Another relief of trapped blood. Another reprieve. She whispered through the rest of it, her voice like someone singing a lullaby in a war zone, which was exactly what this was. 3 miles, see you soon. 4 miles in the sun. At 0447, his eyes opened. Just for a moment. Just a flutter of awareness in the midst of sedation and trauma. His pupils focused on her face, and his cracked lips shaped a word she couldn't quite hear. His hand tightened against hers with the strength of a man hanging onto the edge of a cliff. She leaned closer. I'm here, Sergeant Major. His eyes closed again, but his grip didn't loosen. She kept her hand there. Kept the cadences going. Kept the CVP reading steady. Kept breathing because breathing was something. At 0600, the monitor alarm shrieked again. Pressure at 14.1. Critical. Her hands moved. The needle. The hiss. The relief. She was operating on pure muscle memory now, the kind that lives deeper than thought, the kind that understands that stopping is death. She had been awake for 14 hours. She did not feel it. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their monotonous frequency. Somewhere down the hall, a patient called for a nurse who wouldn't come fast enough. Somewhere in the hospital, Sterling was sleeping in his office, making phone calls on an encrypted line, activating his network. But here, in this room with its quiet blue glow and its machines and its one Marine who would not quit, there was only Katie and the spaces between heartbeats. She whispered the cadences until her voice went hoarse. Then she whispered them anyway. At 0730, the door opened. Dr. Sterling entered with 2 security guards and a woman from Human Resources carrying a folder. They did not speak. They did not need to. Katie watched them approach the bed with the kind of casual certainty that comes from knowing you have already won. She did not move her hand from the sergeant major's wrist. Sterling set the folder on the bedside table. You are suspended, effective immediately. For unauthorized procedures, practicing beyond your scope of licensure, and insubordination. Security will escort you from the premises. Katie felt his pulse. 87, steady. Better than it had been in 8 hours. She looked at the monitor. Pressure holding at 9.2. Oxygenation at 98%. Color returning to his face like someone waking from a long dream. He crashed 3 times, Katie said quietly. You didn't answer the call bell at 0215. Or 0447. Or 0600. You performed procedures you are not qualified to perform. Katie turned to look at him. Not anger on her face. Not fear. Just the expression of someone who had already calculated exactly how this would end, and who had decided it didn't matter. He would be dead. Not my problem anymore. Sterling gestured to the security guards. Take her out. Katie stood. She placed the sergeant major's hand gently on the bed beside him, keeping her movement slow and deliberate. She walked to the door. At the threshold, she stopped and looked back. The sergeant major's eyes were closed, but his chest was rising and falling with the rhythm she had held steady for 10 hours. She had done what needed doing. That was all that mattered now. The security guards flanked her down the corridor. Rain hammered the hospital windows like an indictment. At her locker, Katie opened the door and reached for the pair of worn combat boots, salt-stained, creased leather, the soles worn thin from years of ground that was not American soil. She held them in her hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of them, feeling the memory of the woman she had been when she wore them every day. Then she placed them back beneath her scrubs. The locker door clicked shut. The cardboard box they gave her contained a cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a succulent with brown-edged leaves dying in slow motion, and a photograph in a plastic frame. 7 faces in desert camouflage. Tikrit, August 2004. Most of them were dead now. She knew because she had held 3 of them as they stopped breathing. Security escorted her through the emergency room in trance into whether that felt personal. The rain fell in sheets. Katie sat at the bus stop across the street from Sacred Heart, watching the building's lights blur through the wet darkness. 4:37 in the morning. The city was still asleep. The hospital was still humming with its night shift, its patients, its machines, its Dr. Sterling writing reports about the nurse who had tried to play doctor and gotten herself terminated for her trouble. She believed she had lost her last chance. She believed that the only version of herself that mattered, the one who could move a needle through skin with precision, who could calculate pressures and adjust vasopressors in increments of tenths, who could whisper cadences to dying Marines and pull them back from the edge, was being erased from official record even as she sat on this bench. She did not know that in a room on the 3rd floor, the sergeant major was opening his eyes and seeing Dr. Sterling accept praise for his expert management of the case. She did not know that the next words out of that Marine's mouth would rewrite everything. By noon, Katie's hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from 10 hours of precision. The sergeant major's vitals had stabilized at 0600. His blood pressure no longer dropped like a stone every time she adjusted his central line. The room had gone quiet except for the ventilator's steady wheeze and the soft beep of the cardiac monitor, and for the first time since midnight, she'd allowed herself to breathe. Then Dr. Sterling walked past her in the hallway, phone already pressed to his ear. "I need this handled before end of business," he said, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no. Katie watched him disappear around the corner toward his office, already dialing. She'd seen that expression before. In Tikrit. On the faces of men about to burn something down. By 12:30 hours, Sterling had made 3 calls. The first was to a hospital board member named Harrison Pierce, a real estate developer who'd steered a lucrative parking contract extension Sterling's way 2 years prior. "I need you to understand something," Sterling told him, his voice smooth as oil over concrete. "There's a nurse on my trauma service. Night shift. She's been practicing beyond her scope, performing procedures without authorization. If the state board doesn't move on this, the liability exposure falls on administration. Could get ugly." Pierce made a call to the board president by 12:45. The second call was to a licensing investigator Sterling had covered for during a malpractice deposition 5 years ago, a moment of convenient amnesia that had saved the investigator's career when his own documentation got a little loose on a pharmaceutical company case. "Marcus," Sterling said, his tone suggesting old friendship rather than old debts. "I have a situation. Unauthorized medical procedures. Evidence of scope creep that could compromise patient safety. I'm forwarding documentation. Need this on the board's radar fast." The investigator promised to expedite. The third call was to his personal attorney, who drafted a complaint to the state nursing board in 90 minutes. Practiced beyond scope of licensure. Unauthorized administration of emergency procedures. Patient endangerment through unsupervised interventions. The dates were backdated. The procedural language was crafted with surgical precision. It didn't mention that those procedures had saved a Marine's life, or that every single one had been performed under life-threatening emergency conditions that legally permitted exactly what Katie had done. It mentioned none of that because precision, Sterling understood, was knowing what to omit. By 1400 hours, hospital security found Katie in the supply closet where she was restocking the crash cart, a place that had become her geography since Sterling pulled her from trauma rotation. The security officer was young, uncomfortable, holding a cardboard box that smelled like industrial plastic and regret. "You're being terminated," the officer said, and those 5 words landed like shrapnel. Not suspended. Not investigated. Terminated. Effective immediately. The box in his hands contained her cracked coffee mug, the one with the anchor that had survived 2 deployments, a succulent plant that had been dying slower than her career, and a photograph in a plastic frame. The photo showed 7 people in desert camouflage, arms linked, taken in front of a concrete barrier in Tikrit. All of them smiling. Most of them dead now. Katie took the box without protest. Her hands were steady when she held it, but her arms felt hollow. The officer escorted her to the employee lot where rain had begun to fall, the kind of rain that came to San Diego maybe 3 times a year and meant something was breaking open in the sky that nobody had seen coming. By 15:30 hours, Katie was sitting on a bus stop bench 2 blocks from Sacred Heart, watching the hospital's lights blur through water and exhaustion. The rain hammered down like applause nobody had asked for. She held the photograph in her lap, 7 faces running together now. Rodriguez. Chen. Morrison, no relation, but they'd shared a call sign anyway. All of them carrying the same secret she carried, that the official story and the true story were different documents written in different languages. She believed, sitting there on that bench as dawn threatened to break, that she'd lost her last chance. Not her last job. Her last chance to practice the only kind of medicine that had ever mattered, the kind where your hands were the difference between a person going home and a person not going home at all. That kind of medicine didn't exist behind a desk. It didn't exist in forms and compliance reviews. It existed in the dark, in moments when the official record and the real record split apart, and someone had to choose which one to follow. The rain came down harder. Her scrubs clung to her chest like they were trying to hold something together that had already come apart. But Katie didn't know about Marcus Rodriguez. She didn't know that Marcus Rodriguez, the IT director who'd served with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines in Fallujah and still carried the weight of what he'd seen there, had been in the hallway at 0347 when Drive Sterling tried to access the security system. Rodriguez had seen the timestamp. Had seen Sterling moving through the administrative section like a man erasing something. Had followed the access logs. Rodriguez had watched Sterling at the nursing station computer at 0320, inserting fabricated disciplinary notes into Katie's file, backdating them 3 weeks, creating a paper trail of violations that had never happened. Rodriguez had saved every frame Sterling tried to delete. The cafeteria incident. The tray hitting the floor. Sterling's voice, "Pick that up, sweetheart." Katie's response, captured in audio so clear you could hear the rain in her voice even though the rain hadn't started yet. Just her voice, steadier than steel wrapped in silk, steadier than anything Rodriguez had ever heard. By 1500 hours the next afternoon, Rodriguez walked into the hospital administrator's office with a laptop and an external hard drive that contained something Sterling hadn't anticipated, someone who still believed in the code. Rodriguez spent 37 minutes explaining phantom consultations totaling $340,000 over 18 months. Medical equipment billed to Medicare that had never existed. A kickback scheme with a supply contractor named Jameson that inflated device costs by 40% and split the difference into Sterling's accounts. But mostly, Rodriguez explained the video. The footage. The proof that Sterling had actively tampered with evidence and falsified personnel files. The FBI agents arrived at 1,620 hours. They sat Sterling down in a hospital conference room with walls the color of institutional surrender, and they laid out every piece of it. Sterling's attorney arrived at 16:30, advised him to say nothing, and by 1800 hours, Dr. Sterling was escorted from Sacred Heart by hospital security, his medical privileges suspended pending criminal investigation. His hands were shaking as he walked past the emergency department. Nobody noticed. Everyone was looking at the security footage Rodriguez had printed and posted on the break room bulletin board. Katie standing in the cafeteria soup puddle, the patient chart in her hands, her face composed and devastating, a woman in the middle of being humiliated and refusing to break. The charges against Sterling came fast. His attorney negotiated a plea that kept him out of prison but revoked his medical license permanently. 9 months later, Sterling was teaching CPR at a community college in Chula Vista for minimum wage, his hands shaking as he demonstrated chest compressions on a rubber dummy to 19-year-old students who didn't know his name used to mean something. And then Katie's phone rang. It was the hospital administrator. "We need to talk," the administrator said. "Tomorrow. 0800 hours. My office." Katie didn't know yet that Sacred Heart had created a new position. Trauma Clinical Director. A position designed exactly for her. She didn't know that the hospital's legal team had reviewed every moment of the cardiac tamponade case and found that she'd acted within scope, within protocol, and with medical precision that had saved a Marine's life. She didn't know that Rodriguez had already drafted a recommendation letter that compared her clinical skills to the best trauma surgeons he'd served with, and that sometimes the best trauma surgeons wore scrubs instead of dress uniforms. She only knew that tomorrow, at 0800 hours, something was about to change. Her worn combat boots were still in her locker, hidden beneath her spare scrubs like a secret waiting to become history. If you've ever been underestimated and proven them dead wrong, you understand what Katie Morrison just started living. Subscribe for more stories where the quiet warrior becomes the person nobody saw coming. Like this video, because heroes don't always wear titles. And comment below, when's a time you stayed silent while someone misjudged you, and then showed them exactly who you really were?